We have games. That's all. We play games. What if? How many men? What would it take? Is there a cheaper way to destabilize a regime?
Boy, what is it with you people? You think not getting caught in a lie is the same thing as telling the truth?
No. It's simple economics. Today it's oil, right? In 10 or 15 years, food, plutonium, and maybe even sooner. Now, what do you think the people are going to want us to do then?
Ask them.
Not now. Then. Ask them when they're running out. Ask them when there's no heat in their homes and they're cold. Ask them when their engines stop. Ask them when people who've never known hunger start going hungry. You want to know something? They won't want us to ask them. They'll just want us to get it for them.
Boy, have you found a home?
Welcome to This Explainer. Let's jump right in. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating and honestly pretty highly charged theory about the hidden mechanics that have been driving over a century of global conflicts. We're going to look at history not through the usual lens of political ideologies or public treaties, but through the pipelines and pump jacks that actually power the modern world. It's a journey into what several historians and analysts argue is the true architect of international relationships.
Okay, to really get this, let's start with a gripping modern anomaly analyzed by Professor Ilan Kapoor. Picture a massive U.S. military strike on Iran's Karg Island. Now, Karg Island handles the vast majority of Iran's crude oil exports, so a strike there makes total sense in a conflict, right? Well, here's the catch. The strike deliberately left the country's main oil export terminal completely untouched.
What's really staggering here is the explicit admission behind that military decision. On Truth Social, former President Donald Trump publicly stated that the destruction was heavily calibrated to preserve the oil infrastructure. According to Professor Kapoor, this reveals a much deeper, older logic at work. The objective isn't just weakening an adversary, it's about safeguarding the mobility of oil itself. Even in the middle of a fierce military conflict, the energy arteries that act as the lifeblood of the global capitalist economy absolutely must be protected.
So you might be wondering, why on earth would you spare your enemy's most valuable asset? To solve that mystery, our sources tell us we need to flash back through a century of history. We've got to trace the origins of what they call oil diplomacy and extractive imperialism. Basically, how exactly did this thick black sludge become the ultimate dictator of foreign policy? Section 1. Origins of the Oil War, the British Navy's black gold. Let's step back in time and see how the need for this one specific resource fundamentally rewired global power structures. According to historian Dr. John Coleman, the real scramble for global control started way back in 1904. That's when Captain Fisher, who later became Lord Fisher, proposed that the British Navy pivot from burning Welsh coal to burning oil. This was a total game changer. It literally turned crude oil from a simple illumination tool, like lamp oil, into the ultimate military necessity. Oil-fired ships could reach peak power in 5 minutes instead of taking hours. But there was a huge catch. Britain had absolutely no known domestic oil reserves. They had to look outward, which led to a frenzy of overseas exploration, like William Darcy striking oil in Persia in 1908. Because national security was suddenly completely dependent on a foreign resource, we see the birth of aggressive global oil cartels. Giants like Standard Oil in the U.S. and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which we now know as BP, were formed to lock down these reserves at absolutely any cost. Their goal wasn't just trade. They wanted total, uncompromised control of the source. This strategic dominance was violently cemented during World War I. There were incredible, desperate moments, like French General Gallieni commandeering a whole armada of petrol-fueled Parisian taxicabs just to rush troops to the front lines. Without that fuel, France likely would have fallen. As Britain's Lord Curzon famously put it at a 1918 victory dinner, the Allies literally floated to victory on a wave of oil. From that moment on, any nation with oil deposits was firmly in the crosshairs of global superpowers.
Moving right along to Section 2, Diplomacy, Deception, and Intervention. Stated versus hidden motives.
Dr. Coleman points out a really stark divide that emerged as the 20th century progressed, a divide between what leaders told the public and the actual, hidden material motives behind their actions. Take Mexico in the 1910s, for example. When massive oil reserves were discovered along the Gulf Coast, the Mexican government tried to assert national control over them. In response, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson deployed warships to Tampico. The public justification? Preserving democracy and protecting American citizens from a dictator? But our sources argue the hidden motive was entirely commercial, securing Standard Oil's monopoly and stopping Mexico from controlling its own natural resources.
And this evolves into something much more systematic as we move into the modern era. Author John Perkins calls this the economic hitman playbook. It's an alleged system designed to quietly subjugate resource-rich nations without having to immediately send in the troops. Step 1, arrange massive international loans for a target country. Step 2, make sure that money flows directly to Western corporations to build infrastructure. And Step 3, when the country inevitably can't pay back that massive debt, you demand your pound of flesh, which usually means cheap oil or favorable political compliance at the UN.
But the really crucial point, according to Perkins, is what happens when this covert financial playbook actually fails. If a leader of an oil-rich nation refuses to play ball, refuses to trade oil on favorable terms, or, worst of all, tries to nationalize their resources, well, the strategy escalates. Our sources argue that's exactly when you start to see covert interventions, assassinations, or, as a final resort, full-scale military invasions.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Iraq invasions, the fight for the Mosul.
This takes us directly to one of the most contentious geopolitical arenas of our time. Dr. Coleman claims this exact imperial playbook has been brutally applied to the Middle East, specifically targeting the historically coveted oil fields of Iraq. The sources argue that to understand the repeated conflicts in Iraq, you have to contrast the public narratives with the material realities. The stated public reasons are usually about fighting tyranny or locating weapons of mass destruction, but the claimed hidden motive, the historical constant over decades, is simply the drive to control the world's second-largest oil producer and those incredibly rich Mosul oil fields.
In fact, Dr. Coleman poses a pretty provocative question to hammer home his thesis. He asks, if Iraq did not contain huge oil resources, would the U.S. be bogged down in that country today? He boldly claims that foreign policy is virtually entirely dictated by commercial petroleum interests rather than human rights or global security. Whether you agree or not, it's definitely a fascinating lens through which to view decades of headlines.
Finally, let's look at Section 4, the extractive imperialism strategy. Snapping back to the present day, we see how Professor Ilan Kapoor synthesizes all of this.
He looks at these decades of conflict and sums it up as extractive imperialism. According to Kapoor, when global superpowers intervene abroad, the primary objective is almost never state building. It is strictly about preserving the energy arteries of the global economy. The system simply cannot and will not tolerate any interruptions to its own lifelines.
Kapoor points out that this underlying logic is literally playing out all over the map today, regardless of whatever political rhetoric is being used. It perfectly explains the intense pressure on Venezuela, which sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. It explains the careful recalibration of sanctions on Russian energy to prevent global price spikes. And crucially, it's expanding way beyond oil now. Superpowers are aggressively positioning themselves for access to rare earth minerals in places like Greenland and Ukraine, because those are the new critical arteries for advanced electronics and renewable energy.
And that brings us right back to our opening mystery on Karg Island. Through the lens of extractive imperialism, it makes perfect sense. The strike was a carefully calculated signal. It showed that a superpower will eagerly punch an enemy's military capacity, but it absolutely will not cut the artery and bleed out the global economic system. The oil has to keep flowing.
So, when we synthesize all these sources, a really gripping alternative narrative emerges. For over a century, right beneath the surface of shifting political rhetoric, the hidden architect of international diplomacy, covert operations, and outright warfare has remarkably remained the same, securing the unbroken flow of resources.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, right? It fundamentally challenges how we consume the news. I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought from our sources to ponder the next time a major global conflict dominates your feed. Are the world's superpowers truly managing global security, or are they just managing the pipeline? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, and I'll see you next time.